Good evening. Welcome to this evening's on that ReGen Ag Chat. This is number 19. It's part of the Making Your Farm Resilient series. This is number 2, and tonight we're going to be talking about silvopastoral systems. So we're being joined by Nigel Kendall from the University of Nottingham, which we'll speak to in a moment, and Dan Carne from Woodmeadow Trust. Sorry, my brain isn't quite in gear. Nick, help me. What's happened since our last one?
What's happened? Good evening, everyone. I have had the pleasure of you visiting us with your roaming flip chart, and we did a it was like probably a half an hour brainstorm after we'd had quite a bit of wine one night and come up with a plan for carbon calling next year. It's quite exciting. We've got a speaker, very well-known speaker that we're trying to catch. Allure. We have here on the farm, Renault's had his mullet cut again, so that's looking good. We did a grazing course, which was good. Cows were on the last rotation, and we also had the film crew from 6 inches of soil out here for a day, which the film won't be out till next November, but it's like they're trying to do a Kiss the Ground UK version, so that was good. Slightly worried about avian flu, and the chickens will have to come in soon, which will be a pain. And the other bit is we did a taste test, I was saying to you just before, with some chefs, and they were quite worried about our grass-fed meat not being hugely marbled, but when they actually tasted it and got over their marbling bias, they loved it. So that kind of has given us a boost, as we were slightly worried that it was going to be a bit of a problem with just them thinking that meat has to be marbled. But as I said to them, cattle are herbivores, not grainivores.
Ooh.
Oh, I know.
Who did you steal that from?
I don't know. Was it you?
No,
but I think it's quite good.
Yeah.
So I think
put it on a t-shirt.
I know. I think it should be on our t-shirts. Yeah, but yeah.
Oh no, I compared to that, I haven't done very much. I've started a holistic management course, so I'm doing the 3LM one. So that's
who'd have thought Liz Genever doing a holistic management course?
I had to defend this position. I was at Sheep Farm. Yeah, I was at Farmers Weekly Awards as I was judging Sheep Farm of the Year, and had to defend my position on holistic management. But I find it an interesting way of thinking. So that
how are you finding it? Is it are you battling it?
Not really. It is an academic exercise at the moment. That's the challenge. So I'm doing some more face-to-face ones later in the year, so I'm hoping that they're a bit more practical. But it's the challenge of doing it online. So yeah, it's interesting.
It's good. It's good. I'm looking forward to this chat. So I've got a few pictures of what we're doing here, but I've just been out with the camera before it went dark. But yeah, this will be a good chat and lots of interest.
So both of us are slightly obsessed with trees. So I've worked out on the land at home, we have about 3% of our own land owned is woodland, which compared to yours, which is 15.
But this weekend I've been down to Shropshire, kind of Welsh borders, and when I'm up here I'm always banging on that there's not enough trees, but actually down there, in comparison to Cumbria, there's loads of trees, loads of hedges. So I think it's parts of the country are, because we've got loads of stone walls which are great for shelter, but they're not that biodiverse. So we're about 15% tree cover, and as far as hedges go, this is very boring, but we've got 1.5 kilometers of hedges, which is tiny, and we've just had a FIPL grant to put another 1.1 in, which I'll show you, but that's the whole agroforestry thing.
Well, according to we've got about 8 kilometers of hedges.
Have you?
Oh. But that is, back to your point, which is in this bit of the world, it is hedges are the main field boundaries, hardly any walls. So yeah, and we're just in the process of putting in this is like competitive tree planting, but similar to you, we've just got a grant for the Woodland Trust to put some trees in. So the plan for this evening is for me I haven't done my tree planting or tree order yet. So after this conversation, I'll know the species I'm after.
From our 2 maestros. Indeed.
So if Dan and Nigel, if you are happy to switch your mics on, we've stopped wittering on about our stuff. So Dan, I don't know whether is it okay for you to introduce yourself and the Woodmeadow Trust?
Yeah, my name's Dan. I'm an ecologist. I work for the Woodmeadow Trust. My role is director of the UK Woodmeadow Network. And basically what we do is we travel around the country offering encouragement and support to landowners and other organisations to create wood meadows and wood pastures. And
just a point of clarification, how do you define a wood pasture or wood meadow? How many trees is it trees per hectare, or is it not quite that simple?
It's not quite as straightforward as a number of trees per hectare, I would say. So key difference between a wood meadow and a wood pasture is that a pasture is generally managed exclusively by grazing, and a meadow incorporates an element of hay cutting. Historically, wood meadows and wood pastures are thought to be the oldest form of agriculture in Europe, dating back about, well, I'm going to get my figures wrong now, but around 5,000 years or more since the arrival of livestock in Europe. And I think in the past and in a lot of different countries, the kind of ratios of trees to grassland has varied quite a lot, depending on things like latitude and altitude. And you do see true grazing forests as well, which used to be quite a big thing in the UK historically. So you might have anywhere from, in a kind of classic traditional parkland, maybe as few as 6 trees per hectare, up to some sites that have over 200, sometimes as many as 400 trees per hectare, whilst still maintaining a grass sward beneath.
And it's managed by grazing animals, isn't it? So therefore it's got to be enough grass under those trees. It's not plantation type. Okay, thank you.
That's right.
And Nigel, can you do the same? Just introduce yourself, please.
Yep, I'm Nigel Kendall. I'm a trace element nutritionist, or a sort of ruminant nutritionist, really. Do a lot of work with trace elements in terms of diagnosis of status and supplementation. Work at the vet school at the University of Nottingham, teach them how to handle sheep and things like that. And do you realise Dan suggested there was a time before sheep, Liz?
I know, it's incredible. It shouldn't be. Well, there was always a goat. It was anyway. There was a small ruminant that's been around for a while.
Yeah, there wasn't a time in human history before large herbivores of some description, and long may they continue from a biodiversity perspective.
And Nick, do you want to show, I suppose, what we're thinking from your perspective? So in the last 10 years, you've massively planted up or increase your area of wood on your farm. So do you want to just, and why you're now moving not just from hedges to more of this grazable tree?
Yeah, let me show you this. Is this, hang on, I'm having a bit of a fluster in my sharing. Can you see that?
Yep.
So we've done lots of hedge planting, but this field, when we had the beast from the east in
2018, yeah.
This is a field actually that all the sheep died in. So they all ran across it to a wall on the other side and just kind of rolled over themselves in a big snowdrift. But this is quite an exposed field. It gets battered from the east wind. So we were just walking in it one day with our Woodland Trust man, P. Leeson, and we were already kind of thinking that everything was enjoying browsing on the hedges we had. So in a moment of madness, we just on the back of, I was going to say a fag packet, but it wasn't a fag packet. We just quickly designed a 5-metre hedge with Pete Leeson of the Woodland Trust. And this is so you imagine what our neighbours think. They already think we're slightly odd, and then we go and do this in the middle of a field. So it's 5 meters wide, and it's got kind of a centre line with oaks and silver birch alternate, and then the next line in is things like crabapple and rowan, and I've written some things down here. And then the outside one is kind of willow and hazel, hawthorn. And so this was planted in 19, and we had to water it actually because there was a bit of a drought going on. So it was a bit of a pest at one time because we had to spend a bit of time faffing on with a water pipe and a bowser. But we fenced it. We put smooth wire on the top line of fencing so we can electrify that, so they're not going to kind of push on it when they do browse. And then that was it tonight at about 6 o'clock. And it's we've kind of replaced some that didn't make it, but it's kind of on its way. But the thing which we haven't put in any of our existing hedges up until this point was willow, and that is just going for it. And Nigel, you'll tell me this, won't you? But I'm not very much. I don't know anything particularly academic about trees, but willows are good, aren't they?
Well, in what I've done, yeah, certainly there's some nice advantages of willow. One of which being that it grows quickly.
Mm. So that will be planted in 19. So, and that's the crab apples have really gone for it, but those two are the biggest ones. So that, and whenever people come, this is come around to see stuff. This is always a good conversation starter. And some farmers cannot get their heads around it. Like, what have you done in the middle of a field? And then the other thing, and there's a question on the chat, but so we've just had. If FIPL is farming in protected landscapes, and you have to be in an ANOB. I don't know if it's all ANOBs, but it's if you're in an ANOB, have a Google. And we've just had the go ahead for, so all these green lines will be new hedges, and they'll be 12 foot wide, and it will be a hedge, and then we're also going to put fruit trees in among the hedges. So every 6 meters there'll be a apple, wild pear, lots of different fruit trees, and we're also putting some water, like planning on how we're going to do the water for the grazing. So each one of those little alleyways is about it's just like over three acres. So we'll rotate the cattle down there, and then the chickens and the tourists. So I've just got this vision eventually, I hope I'm still alive, that they'll be full of blossom. It'll just be an absolute picture. And then with all these hedges, long term, it might not work, but we will then chop them back and use whatever we get off them, the chip for to put in for bedding. So that's a quick whistle stop tour.
Is that north to the top there, so we can see which way it's, because you're talking about the nasty east wind?
Yeah, so north, never eat shredded wheat at the top. Yeah.
So Nigel, you mentioned willow, so do you want to just talk us through willow and why we should love it so?
Well, a few years ago, I started doing some work with the Woodland Trust and a load of other collaborators, including the Allen Tree Project, the Organic Research Centre, University of Bangor, Reading University, and we were just looking at the sort of composition of tree leaves. So yeah, we did the energies of proteins. They're all quite similar. You know, strangely the older is a bit higher, but again is less palatable. But what we did find was the willow is very high in some of the trace elements in cobalt and zinc. So we found that, and it's, you know, that's the bit that really excited me to start with. Going out, oh, hang on, we can use this. And you know, there's some issues with cobalt in feed mills and things with it's been classic, it's got a higher carcinogen classification now. So a lot of you, if you're buying feeds, will find that cobalt's coming out of some and they're just using B12. Some are just dropping cobalt altogether, and the others are having to do lots of forms in their feed mills. So there is a potential of using this, and it potentially gives us a natural supplement. The cobalt's the one that will generally stop your lambs across the dry summer period, your growing lambs especially. So it may be a use of it. We can start using some of these willows, some of these tree borders, some of these hedges to actually supply minerals, save us a fortune on boluses.
And Dan, when we had the pre-chat, you were saying that there's quite a lot of historical context behind this idea.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a lot of benefits, not least the nutritional value, but also there's kind of a knock-on impact on the soils around the trees. Where you put trees in, you get increased nutrient cycling, you're drawing up trace minerals. Pre-agricultural fertilizers, wood meadows and wood pastures were often considered to be quite valuable land, partly because they showed higher productivity in the grassland than simple grasslands. And that's thought to be because of the long-term impact of the tree leaves falling, augmenting the nutrients. But I think also there's increased fungal activity leading to good kind of production of soil carbon, organic matter.
And of course, your roots will break up your soil structure, open your soil structure as well. So it's going to cut out some of your compaction as well.
And not,
Yeah,
I suppose,
and
the question I suppose is follow on from Nick. So is that's with lots of freestanding trees within the field, or is the same benefit can be, so the big hedges that Nick's been talking about, will we see the same benefit, or is it reliant on trees being scattered across those fields?
I think hedges serve as a kind of proxy for a very similar function. In an idealized landscape, I'd love to see more infield trees, but hedges are absolutely fantastic kind of halfway measure.
And you're going to get some of those effects closer to the hedge. The effects is likely to be bigger closer to the hedge. You've got to remember some of these roots under the trees go out as far as the canopy at least.
And you'll get the added benefit of where the hedge is being managed on a cycle. You'll probably find that the extent of the roots varies over the course of the cycle, and it's somewhat dynamic. So you'll see some of the kind of roots that are further away from the hedge breaking down after the hedge has been trimmed. Don't know how much is known about that, but certainly with kind of hedge systems and coppice systems, it's theorized that the root systems break down and rot within the soil. So that must be doing something positive.
So it's the similar idea to the grasses in terms of those roots. As grass goes taller, there's more roots to basically support the more leaf. As the leaf is taken off, hopefully by a grazing animal, some of those roots die away because it isn't able to maintain them all. So it's a similar idea.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's a lot of listeners will have heard about the kind of concept of a more species-rich grassland or a more species-rich herbal ley containing deeper rooting species that are both bringing up those trace minerals, but also doing exactly what you described, Liz, at a slightly deeper level than some of the shallow rooting single species leys like Italian ryegrass, perennial ryegrass.
The
and trees are forming a similar function.
The thing to remember, the minerals are going to be there in the soil. I've seen some work on very sandy soils where you can't draw up mineral if it isn't there. So it still does have to be there.
That's true.
And so in terms of just this idea of planting willow quite strategically, so Nick's example there, so have you seen other examples of how it could be used?
I've seen quite a bit of examples of short rotation coppice, but that's a little bit more slightly off the regen into slightly more intensive willow. But that is very interesting, looking at the amounts there that you can get with that. But some of those techniques, some of those varieties might be something that we can integrate anyhow. I must admit, more on the regen side, that hedge is brilliant with using some sort of fodder trees on the outside for feeding while you establish your big standard oaks, etc. I love that idea.
So if you had an intensive grassland dairy system where cows were walking, you know, they walk long ways, don't they, to the different paddocks, you could think about planting willow hedges along those walkways.
You could do, whether they'd actually, if they're going there every day, dairy cows are going every day, they're going to give them a big hammering. You might be better having some paddocks or corners or the field ends where you could graze into your willow, and there's nothing stopping you, you know, not necessarily grazing it, but dropping it and eating it there. You know, maybe something, you know, over the fence system. Once it grows up high, you know, you knock it down and leave a pollard there, and they can, you know, then graze what falls off.
And is there any difference between hybrid willow and, because we talked about willow, didn't we, the other day, about just talk about willow, because there's goat willow.
There's goat willow, a good old classic willow, which the name might suggest that used to feed goats as browse. So it's quite a broad leaf willow with the cobalt in them. We've looked at a few varieties and they've all got the high cobalt that we're finding. So it just takes up the, well, also zinc that it takes up, and actually cadmium, but there's enough zinc in there to counteract the higher cadmium anyhow. So it's just taking up those sort of 2+ metals to go back to chemistry. So
it's just thinking about it, as you say. So it's as a farm resource, isn't it? So the reason why why I'm particularly interested in it after the year that we've experienced in most places is the dry time, and most places the trees were still green and the grass near them wasn't.
Well, the grass around them would have been, because that's a shading effect, because that's where you did see, and the water draw up, that's where you did see the real good effect of trees. But when we saw all these brown pastures, and then you looked around and people saying, I've got no fodder, and then you look up and see some lovely trees, thinking you're missing a trick here.
I just
and like
think
you say,
the challenge
beneath
we've
the
got,
drip line, sometimes the grass is a bit taller as well, because it's in a drought, trees can augment the water availability, which I always think is counterintuitive.
and that's because they're able to draw so much from lower down, or generating. But just back to the point. But do you not think it's partly that we just have no history of using trees in most grazing systems in the UK?
Well, we have a history, but we've grown away from it. Yeah, if you go back years, as Dan was saying, go back hundreds of years or whatever, we had that system. We had the sort of scrubby grasses. It's as we've improved, I'll put that in quotes, as we've improved, we've lost some of these bits, and things like using trees in the pasture. We've just gone for, we've got to have a big swathe of grass. Yeah, we've got to be able to get our tractors between it, but we can still plant trees tactically that we can work around tractors, make it even better. If you think of working a field, the really awkward bit is that square corner. Well, there's no reason we can't round all those corners off with trees.
I think that's right. I think probably the reason why we've lost more of our infield trees than perhaps some other countries in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, is because we industrialized so early. And it's very easy to work around a tree with a scythe, but it's not so simple when you're in a tractor. But as Nigel says, we can plant strategically. If you've got hilly ground, you can plant to your contours. There's alley cropping, alley planting, and getting rid of those awkward field corners and cutting down on time spent cutting the grass.
Yeah, those wet areas as well, the boggy bits that you don't want to drive across, the bits with the odd rock that you can't move, the bits that suddenly, you know, go steep. You know, there's all these bits of the field that, you know, we can have pods of woodland in, or even areas fenced off so we can open a gate and control the grazing better. You know, as well as, you know, having the corners there, because some of it's going to be about managing it. If it's just there and used all the time, then there's a potential that it's used rather than being useful when it's a drought, or being useful as a cobalt source when we actually need the cobalt going into the lambs.
I think there's
So
probably some value in having things that are available in the way that hedges are available as well, not just because of the nutrients and trace minerals, but because of the medicinal properties that some of these trees have.
And if you're going on that, of course, your willow's got the salicylic acid in it. As I say, it should be good for your sheep pregnancy, because none of your ewes are ever going to have a headache again.
Not sure headaches their issue in lambing time, but carry on. But just again, for the idea of coppicing, or do you mean managing the woodland or pollarding? I was talking to someone who manages some cattle in the Epping Forest, and that has a history of the sort of pollarding, really well managed forest to be grazed alongside cattle. So can you just talk us through the process behind that? So what does it? So pollarding, my understanding, is higher. Coppicing is lower.
Yeah, coppicing is ground cutting and regrowth. Pollarding, you're going to leave some trunk, some stem there to do that. So something, if you want to, if we go into the lambs and the sheep, you don't, they're going to graze to about a meter. The lambs 1.2 meters to use, but if you pollard it at like 1.2, they're not going to graze it until you drop it down. So then you can just go across, get your cutter bar off the side of your quad. I'm not sure the HSE will like that. Drop it all down. Set things up, then you can potentially sort of drop that down, let it fall into the field, and then they've got that bit of grazing. So that's a sort of a cut and drop system, on there. Equally, you could always drop it down in a wood, or if your copper's in right to the ground, then the regrowth can then be grazed.
I suppose it's just
quite interesting historically. Coppice and pollarding and livestock management were quite crucial parts of woodland management. This kind of modern forestry where the only product of a woodland is timber is a relatively recent thing, only really emerging over the last couple of 100 years. Most woodlands that persist today that are ancient woodlands would have been coppiced historically, at least in England. But a lot of our woodlands would have looked very different to our modern idea of what woodland should look like, because they would have been much more open wooded landscapes with livestock as a crucial part of their management system. And from the landowner's perspective, they would have been far more resilient economically because they were producing multiple products. There'd be meat, there'd be timber, but there'd also potentially be nuts and fruit and coppice materials.
Charcoal and baskets.
Yeah. Pollards really are quite an ancient management system, because as soon as livestock arrived in Europe, having come from the Middle East, where we have far more severe winters, and as soon as you get severe winters, there's a need for winter fodder if you're going to keep livestock. And scythes weren't invented until about 2,000 years after livestock arrived in Europe. So up until that point, the only way to produce winter fodder for livestock was tree hay, or lopping pollards, lopping young growth off pollard trees. So it's a really kind of ancient part of our heritage.
Can I just, this is a very basic question, but when you say you lop everything down, and then say with willow, you've got those long, it's like a matchstick, isn't it, with the willow off it? So they nibble the green stuff. Do they eat the matchstick?
Yeah, if it's narrower than about your thumb in width, they'll eat it perfectly happily. And they might eat bigger stuff as well. Yeah,
and they'll certainly will strip bark as well. Is the other thing as well, because there's and one of the other things, of course, talking with bark and all these trees, if we've got tannins in there, and there's potential for tannins to help with protein metabolism, as well as potentially looking into some anthelmintic properties as well. So the fact that feeding trees might actually help you control your worms.
Because I don't know what the people on the call think. I just can't envisage tree, like I can't see the process. How
of which bits?
The tree hay, the tree hay.
You chop it off and take it in a barn and hang it up.
Hang it up.
Yeah,
it's like drying a herb.
It's like drying a herb. So you go to your roof things, you hang it up, dry it there, or literally, I know somebody who did some pollarding, dropped it on trailers, left it on the trailers in the barn, and it dried on the trailers in the barn.
Because I think tying it up.
I've known people who can't face the kind of extra work of that process, and the kind of halfway solution that they've come up with is you let your sheep or your cattle into a field, you see what species in the hedge they're going straight for, or what species of tree they're trying to nibble the bark off, and you just respond by lopping a few of the branches off to make it easier for the animals. They quite often know what they're lacking, and they'll make an effort to try and get it.
Well, they know what they like. They don't necessarily
know what they like.
Lacking.
They know what they crave.
Nigel, there's a particular technical question on your copper and zinc supplementation in the Q&A. Do we need to offer in terms of, so if we want to use willow as a cobalt and zinc supplement, how can we best do this? Do we need to offer it as the leaves, young stems, daily? Does copper and zinc levels vary through the season? How much do we need to supply? Can we chip it onto pastures to move that into the fields? There's a lot of questions. What is the content
a lot
of
questions.
Is there any negative effect? You've got some slides.
I've got some slides which actually answer most of that, but let's get back to the hang on, I'll get my screen sharing. So it should be coming up. So I've also got a cat that's deciding that despite being fed, it wants to be fed again. Unfortunately, it doesn't eat willow. So hopefully the screen shared now, is it seeing? So so we're looking really at minerals for sheep. This is something I did at Groundswell and Organic Farm, Oxford Real Farmers Congress conference. So looking at background, so this is what we found with the trees. We found that this is on a log scale, so we found this really high cobalt in the willow compared to all the other trees. There's oaks in there, alders, sycamores, ash, beech, chestnut, and the numbers are just different sites. 3 and 4 up in Bangor. 1 I think was Loddington, which is East Leicestershire, and 2 I think was down at Reading. So and then also we got a similar effect with zinc. That's not logged, but still a high effect. So so about 10 times the actual sheep requirement for cobalt in the willow. I'll try and do this quickly. So the basic nutrients, we've got basic ME there, we've got basic crude protein, and those are lamb requirements. I think it says there, a 20 kilo lamb grown at 250, a 40 kilo lamb grown at 150. That's so it's certainly able to support a fairly decent growth rate by itself. But if you mix it in with you know, some really good grass grazing, you can support a really good growth rate. And what can you do with a high cobalt? Well, you get the seasonal. Somebody asked about this is perennial ryegrass, the seasonality, and it dips down. So on there, so we get this well, we were getting it in July, August, September these years. Difference over here was a difference in the seasons, and then you know the lamb requirements here. So we've got a big gap to fill there on lamb requirements to get the growth going. Then by the time we get to this time of year, the cobalt's on its way up, because as it gets wetter, the redox potential alters and the cobalt into the grass gets much higher. So using a supplemental feed, so some sheep, 3 treatments. So we gave them basically willow, 300 grams per day fresh, a drench or cobalt drench as bits of positive control, and nothing. Bled them and weighed them day 0, day 14, really looking at vitamin B12 concentrations. So just to check, our willow is much higher than our grass. Our grass was slightly below the lamb requirement. The willow was well above it. This we fed in buckets. There's a it was a vet student at the time. He's now a vet up in North Yorkshire. So he's now graduated and got a job up there. Luckily, he's about 6'4", which was really handy for stripping leaves off trees. And he ended up sort of giving all these willow out in the bucket. So that's a load of willow fed for the lambs. Did they eat it? Well, certainly, yep. They were piling into it here. There we go. There's a plot roughly what they're eating. Took a couple of days to get going, but they were eating it. And vitamin B12's there. We got a really good response. I've got another one which is actually in the full paper where we classified the sheep grazing each pasture, whether they were deficient, marginal, or adequate. And you'll see the willow on the day 14 had all the sheep adequate, when all the other treatments had at least some of the marginal. So we were actually having, you know, we're in the realms of a potential production response. And that's picking labor intensive, there's anthelmintic properties. And I probably should put the acknowledgements up there of people that were involved. So that was that, and hopefully it's picked up some of those. We've since done, oops, let's stop sharing. We've since done some work where we've gone back in and we fed lower amounts of willow and still got the same amount. And equally, we've just recently done some work where we've fed about 50% of the dry matter as willow. and then we're looking at responses there, but that's still looking. But some of the other things we found, Chris at the Allerton project, they've done some urine analysis and found that we get less nitrous dioxide coming off the urine on the sheep that have been eating willow. And we've been looking certainly into some anthelmintic properties, some compounds within it that will potentially work with anthelmintics. In terms of whether you need to go into it daily, probably not. Going back to drenches, if we go weekly drenches, we can get a good supplementation of willow. Fortnightly drenching, maybe not. So if you've got, one of my ideas is if you have your little paddock that you open the gate once a week, put them in for a day, bring them out, let the willow recover. They can be at the grass for the rest of the week, and then go in again another day in the week. Or you've just got, you're moving that. So it's a matter of management. You may have to manage it. You may have to open the gate, walk them in, or walk them through, walk them through the hedge. Some of these hedges, once they've established and you've got that pollarded base, as long as you've still got your tree guards on your standards, there's a potential of grazing out the base of those trees, as well as them getting the, dropping some of the pollard top down to them, and they can just go through that for a day as they move from one side to the other. Almost use it as a creep system.
Getting our head around also that recovery rate, isn't it? I mean, it's not like it's not going to be a 21-day rotation in terms of how quickly they can go back once they've decimated some of these. Yeah, well, it isn't the best for the mineral supplementation. The absolute feed and feed for 21 days, don't go back in for 42, isn't going to work. Going in for one day, coming out for a few days, going in, that regular chopping, that little and often is going to work a lot better than having a massive great feed on it and then going, then not being able to go back in because you've absolutely grazed it off. So it will require some management. And I suppose there's also an association with, particularly with oak leaves, acorns. Do you mean not always? And cattle and sheep who eat them don't always survive. The oak leaves are fine. I think it's the acorns on the poisoning would be that bit. But then again, these poisonings, I got a shock the other day when I was on a farm. I know we're going slightly off trees, but I was stood in a farm and there was like ragwort there that had been grazed all up the side. I was thinking, hang on, ragwort's toxic. But actually, when you follow it, for sheep, it's actually being used for, they're using sheep across, there's a load of papers in Germany that are using sheep to actually clear ragwort out the way for cattle and horses. It's more toxic for cattle and horses, but it seems to be a lot less toxic for sheep than we were actually led to believe. I spent years being made to pull ragwort.
So Nigel, you must have been quite excited by that project.
Yes, from the results of getting something that we can get a natural supplement. It fits great into organic systems, low input systems. We got somewhere where we can grow a supplement rather than have to go and pay £1.20 for a dose for a lamb. We've got that. We can save a fortune here putting in money terms as well, and have some nice biodiversity. One of the other biodiversity, willows about your first pollen of the year as well, so it's great for your bees and your pollinators. And also, if you keep a few hives, have some nice honey.
Yeah, and if you've got a few different tree species, you can extend your pollinator season absolutely brilliantly. It strikes me, Nigel, that kind of cobalt gap that you were pointing at in late summer, if you were asking an ecologist kind of when is the best possible time of year for me to graze my grassland for biodiversity, if you were leaving that for, say, a standing hay crop, so you're treating it in the same way as a kind of saving that grassland for that time of year, that is the optimal time to be putting your stock onto it. So it's one of those nice occasions where it's what's best for biodiversity as well as being brilliant from a nutritional perspective. Well,
yes, no, maybe it may be in the cobalt, but if you've gone old on your swards, you've probably lost a bit of your protein, a bit of your energy and your fiber, so you're probably not going to get your lambs going at 300, 400 grams per day on that. So it depends what your production system is, but it's come down now. The counter question is, when is the best time to use a leaf off a tree from a biodiversity point of view?
From a biodiversity point of view, you're probably looking at using it as late in the year as possible. From traditional kind of nutritional perspective, it would have been kind of July, August time that you'd be lopping that tree hay and preserving it for the winter.
But the thing we mustn't forget, and the thing I forgot initially on this, is willow regrows.
That's true.
So your leaf actually regrows.
So we manage a little wood meadow in Yorkshire where we take the hay cut mid-July when it's kind of finished flowering and set seed. And quite a lot of other kind of nature conservation projects always find it slightly shocking that we've still got quite a lot of flowers present in mid-July, and then we're taking a hay cut right in the middle of summer when there's a lot of bees and butterflies buzzing about. But that is the time of year before the grass really starts to reinvest heavily into its root system, isn't it? If you leave it much later than mid-July, you're losing a lot of quality of that grass. And from a biodiversity perspective, you're kind of wasting it on the soil, which shocks people. They think, oh, we've shortened our kind of pollen season, but by the time we get to mid-August, early September, it's all reflowering again. So actually, I think in the long run, we have a longer flowering season than we would if we left it later.
The other thing we tend to think of is we tend to think of a field as a whole field. I know Nick doesn't, because she likes splitting it in half by chucking a hedge up the middle, but we tend to think of a field as a whole field. There's no reason we can't cut a strip fairly early, let that regrow while we let another strip next to it grow a bit older, and sort of cut that or graze that later, and have that mix of ages. We don't have to do the whole field at once.
Yeah, it's that patchiness, that kind of variety of structure is always brilliant biodiversity. It's kind of one of the real aspects of modern farming where we're getting pushed towards a product. Historically, we've been pushed towards productivity on a larger and larger scale, is that it creates uniformity, which is anathema to biodiversity, because most species of plant or wildlife or animal, they need a variety of conditions, and different species have pernickety different requirements. And if you do everything on the farm exactly the same, you're going to support a very small variety of species. Whereas you've just got a little bit of inconsistency, like you say, Nigel, of this bit's cut that date, that bit's cut later. There's somewhere where species can move across the farm, so at no point are they getting completely
and
lost.
It's going back to the old scythe times when we had the scythe invented. It's a time where you'd have went out in your fields, cut close to your field barn, and then that would be regrowing while you're cutting a bit further away, and then you'd have ended up with fields just for the actual physical time to cut the field with your scythe would have been spread out. So you'd have ended up with this range of age in your grassland.
Whereas today, you go out and you do it in a few days, don't you?
About to say, my whole field's gone in half a day usually. So yeah.
Just before I get my scythe sharpened,
all dark.
I'm not going down that route. But but I suppose the challenge we've got is that it's how we apply some of these techniques and into modern farming, isn't it? Because in terms of engagement, it's like the tree hay we've had a discussion about. There's a question about how it works when the leaves fall off. But that on the scale of quite a lot of our commercial farms, they're not, if we turn around and said, what you've got to do this winter is make some tree hay, it isn't likely to float their boat. So I suppose I'm interested in ideas of how we can get that so it starts to integrate into, I know it's sort of covering up some of the cracks of our modern day production systems, but I'm just interested in that rather than.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fair point. And probably the most practical way to introduce trees to a system is to do something along the lines of what Nigel suggested, of having areas of trees there in reserve so you can let your cattle or your sheep into them at certain times of year and control the extent to which they're browsing the trees, or they're throughout, but you kind of leave it up to the livestock to eat both the browse and the grazing. I visited a lovely project down in Herefordshire recently where it was probably about a 15-20 hectare field, quite a circuitous field on a floodplain that probably historically would have been broken up into quite a lot of small fragments. And they had been managing it just by taking single silage cut a year and then aftermath grazing. But it had quite a lot of those bumpy bits and those boggy bits and awkward corners that meant it took twice as long as it should have done. And the last 10% took longer than the first 90%. And all that landowner's done is stopped cutting that 10% that was difficult. And they found that they're getting some natural regeneration of trees. And when the trees appear, they just whack a tree guard on it. They're still letting the cattle in as they usually would, but in the long term, they're going to have that resource available for the livestock. But they've also cut down the amount of time that they're spending managing that area of land.
And I suppose as Nick is with her alleyways, do you mean it's also planning it so we can fit grazing systems? Do you mean using those trees almost as the dividers or subdivision across fields?
Yeah, quite a lot of orchards that I work with, we just plant the trees far enough apart that you can get a tractor and machinery down in between them. And if there's 1 or 2 metre strip between trees that you fail to get with the cut, it's okay because the livestock will come along and get that later.
The classic arable agroforestry now, you're looking at sort of 40 meters, so you can get a full sprayer boom down there or whatever. So, and then, a few rows of the combine. So it's similar for the sort of, if you're going down with a fertilizer spreader or a sprayer or anything, even on grassland, having that, there's no reason you can't do something every sort of 40 meters.
And
I think if you did want to produce something in the kind of similar to tree hay, but on a slightly more industrial scale, perhaps you could do something like what Nick's doing of trimming her hedges and then using the offcuts either for chip or as something to feed livestock, or like Nigel suggested, short rotation willow coppice that you can actually harvest with machinery.
I'm about to say, talking about the willow, I know somebody who had a load of willow and pollarded them onto a trailer, and they dried on the trailer, and then we're sort of talking about feeding them out. He started sort of throwing them out, then couldn't be bothered, so he chipped the whole lot, but it's feeding it to a dry cow. So the actual wood chip then being a lower density feed in the dry cows actually worked quite well. I was slightly worried because one of the other things actually I didn't mention, willow is slightly higher in calcium, so it's not necessarily the best dry cow feed in that respect, but that was on the leaf with the stem on it as well. We possibly had lower calcium, but it worked great as a sort of filler to keep the animals full without the full thing. Is that was an organic dairy herd, so
you'll know more about. Sorry, Liz.
No, just a question, just following on from that cattle. So I know the work you showed was cobalt, in lambs, but the principle would be the same for cattle.
It would, but cattle don't have quite the cobalt requirements that lambs do. We don't have slightly as many cobalt issues. The real big from the cobalt deficiency area is those fast growing grazing lambs across that summer, across the autumn. So it's not such an issue, but there's no reason your cattle couldn't graze. It's just not quite so interesting because cobalt in cattle isn't such a big problem.
Okay, so that sort of a little bit of foraging as they walk past a hedge would be appropriate for them.
Yeah, it's just there, and a bit of interest, a bit there, and then zinc's always useful to have in there. An animal won't take up zinc till it's got a need, till it's got a big immune response, or it's got the growth. It's very homeostatically regulated zinc, so it's a matter of with zinc of having it there, but it isn't necessarily going to be used until they want to use it.
And just to continue on the sort of the idea of how often willow regrows, but what's in terms of experience of, is it a 2-month cycle is what we're aiming for?
This is where we really need some funding on research. I'm just doing off what we're going to, so it's really the great big unknown. I suppose it's the matter of grow, look, see when it's open, when you've got enough leaf back. I couldn't put a figure on the basis of this at the moment. I'd quite like somebody to give me lots of research money. I can measure that, get the growth rates, get the full yields. In terms of yield of willow, we're guesstimating at the moment. There's some paper on some real regenerative sort of decontamination type stuff of land. But it's quite interesting, they were getting sort of, little, what about to say, notepad calculations. We're probably somewhere in, if we're talking about a hectare of willow, somewhere in the region of 3 to 10 tons per hectare of willow leaf. And then if we're going to use some of the twig as well, and then of course with that, if we're talking about carbon capture, you get about an equal amount of underground root that you do to the soil, and then you've got what's caught in the stem. Then you've got the potential of using stem for biomass, bedding, so all those other purposes, and you can even make yourself a basket.
I once weaved a sheep out of willow, by the way, just saying.
Wow.
That stopped a conversation dead. Anyway.
So when you see big plantations of willow, we've got some around here. What's the how long do they grow for?
Generally, they will be a 3-year cycle. If they're on slightly more productive land, there might be a 2.5 year cycle. And
is that pure? What's that for? Is that for aspirin?
No, that a lot of that will be biomass. So they're actually looking a lot of that will be looking for. You'll get about 50 to 60 tons per hectare of biomass on that. So about 20 tons per year. So that'll be for the biomass, and the best time to harvest it for biomass is once all the leaf's gone, so in that November, December. So one of the other reasons for looking at utilizing leaf with the short rotation coppers is, can we go in earlier when the ground conditions are better and actually make use of the leaf, almost go into like the combine where we're picking the barley off from the straw, where we're picking the leaf off from the stem can go off to biomass, leaf we can feed.
That'd be amazing, wouldn't it?
Now, you'll know more about this than I do, Nigel, but I read a few studies recently talking about how actually chipping hazel, the way you were describing chipping the willow for dry cows, reduces the amount of methane that they produce. So it could.
I haven't seen that. I know I've seen there's some work out of Ireland, Queen's University, where they've shown that willow actually reduces methane as well. Oh, right. God, another benefit.
Nigel, you are going to be the saviour.
Well, it's not me, it's Willow. Unless I change my name by Deepa, I'm going to become Willow.
Nigel Willow.
Yes.
Willowy Nigel. We love a nickname.
We've lost control. No, we haven't. I'm still trying to find a picture of a willow sheep. That's my problem. I've been distracted. So in terms of Nick's, so I suppose the two questions, or thinking about from Nick's wide hedge perspective. So we've talked about there's silver birch in there and oak as the big trees. So are we thinking them to be pollarded, or is that just too much?
No, I think this is what we're thinking, that the silver birch is a nurse tree. Is that right, Nigel?
I don't know what you mean by nursery.
I think
love silver birches, but
I think it's like a relatively, compared to an oak, a short-term tree, and then
silver birch will grow fast.
Yeah, but then
in your context, it might even help the oak grow a little quicker, because
they talk
you do
to
get
each
this
other.
phenomenon where they draw up the trees either side of them. In a woodland context, you have to be a little bit careful, because sometimes the silver birch grows so fast that it then shades out the slow growing oak. So it's easy enough to go in and selectively thin after a few years.
It's all about getting that relationship, because like looking at the level there, you can be looking at, like, let's establish a big oak with maybe some silver birches that help pull it up, and then you have a shrub layer around that's willow or hazel that you coppice or pollard around that structure, and mixing in with and grazing and the grass in there as well. It's just a matter.
And I guess where we've had some success with pigs, in just putting pigs into a established woodland just to for a short kind of pulse graze, I guess when it's established, that is possibly an option. Just for a short, a couple of days. And they do amazing stuff if they're just in a short time.
So do cattle and sheep will clear the bottom out.
Sorry, Nigel.
I was about to say the cattle and sheep will clear the bottom out, because looking at your recent hedge, there's quite a lot of unused grass in the bottom there. So having your cattle or your sheep running through to take that grazing out, whereas then that will clear the base out a bit, rather than just having that grass growing up and rotting down.
I don't think the
probably
hedge
have to
plants
wait.
are.
Yeah,
you
you're probably
have
not
to wait
quite.
a few years with
yeah.
those guards.
Yeah.
But again, from a biodiversity perspective, you've created a corridor not just of trees, but of rough grassland that's going to be supporting small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, quite a lot of overwintering habitat there for pollinators, because they do exist through the winter and they need that kind of slightly rougher habitat to retreat to after the hay cut's been taken or after all the kind of main fields being grazed off.
And if you've ever been a farm walk with Liz, you'll know that she must go prostrate into any grass she finds. So if it's short on the ground, it gives her some longer grass to go into.
I do like grass.
I think it with our rotational grazing and just the need for smaller blocks of land, I think this and it would be great, and I don't know if it is in elms, but it'd be great to see it as an option in elms, to put in these diverse hedges, because I think it's not cheap, but I think it'll be part of the picture.
Yeah, I think who can predict right now? There's a fair bit of uncertainty, but the last time I spoke with the team that were working on it, they gave me a lot of assurances that there will be something if elms goes ahead to incentivize species-rich hedges and agroforestry in general. So we watch and wait.
And I suppose we also have to highlight that a lot of beef and sheep farmers or graziers in general, I also see trees with trepidation, don't they, because of land being bought out for complete planting from a carbon perspective. But I suppose the systems we're talking about have the benefit of the livestock stay on the land. The trees are also there, and maybe not capturing as much carbon per se per tree, but the whole system works better.
Yeah, I think there's often this narrative that you have to set land aside to plant trees. And that might be true for a few years, but in a farming context, if you've got less productive land, doesn't mean that it has to be completely taken out of the agricultural system. And some people like Jeremy Dagley at the Wood Pasture and Parkland Network will argue that wood pasture actually is more effective at carbon sequestration than woodland, because the trees are there for a lot longer. I think the other benefit that you have is just from a biodiversity perspective, most of the species that we associate with woodland are actually concentrated in the woodland edge and in the open spaces within and around a woodland. So when we go and we plant dense wall-to-wall plantations, if they're large enough, that can be fantastic for timber productivity. But if there's a small woodland, it's never going to be particularly important for timber production. But that kind of wall-to-wall uniform habitat doesn't even support the species that we consider woodland species. Most of them will benefit from something that, again, has that structural patchiness. So a wood pasture or a wood meadow or some sort of agroforestry system is intrinsically kind of a mosaic of more than one habitat on the same patch of ground.
Even checking a field in the middle of a woodland.
Yeah, I just think they're amazing. Just to wax lyrical for slightly longer on the importance and the value of wood meadows. The most species rich, as in the most botanically diverse grasslands in the world, are almost all European wood meadows, because they support all the species we associate with grasslands and all the species that we associate with woodland in the same place. So they're kind of turbocharging the local ecosystem, which is obviously going to have knock-on impacts for pollinators.
And I suppose if the question back to you on the scheme I'm planning at home. So just for background, I've got 2 lumps of old parkland and a area that was arable that's been basically got spinneys in it. So the idea that you can farm around a spinney, not rather than single trees. So the claim to fame is one of the trees in there based on girth diameter is planted 1660. So we've got some decent veteran and ancient woods or trees in that wood or on the park. So our plan is successional plantings. That will be single trees to replace some of those. And then we've also got some trees to put in like additional spinneys or extension of belts. But I think this idea of this very uniform planting scheme is now not what we need to do. And an incorporation of, we've got a range of species. Those parkland are predominantly oaks. We had elms, but obviously were taken out in the 80s.
Yeah.
And traditionally the bit of the world I live in is a very oak dominated place, hardly any beech. So we need to put some of those oaks back, but it's also trying to think of other species that would do well in that planting scheme.
Yeah, I think we've learned that we can't be too reliant on one single species in any kind of planting scheme, because we've had Dutch elm disease, we've got ash dieback, we're going to see more tree diseases coming through because we've got such a connected global network now. So purely from a resilience perspective, I'd be planting more than one species. And where we see oak parklands, historically there would have been quite a few other species in there, including understory species like hawthorn and hazel and blackthorn. And one of the reasons why those have often disappeared in living memory is because they've been grazed slightly harder than they would have been historically. So there's not the natural regeneration. But we can also look at 20th century agricultural subsidies. So not getting into the minefield that is discussing the pros and cons of being in or out of the EU. But when the Common Agricultural Policy was first introduced, people were not allowed to claim subsidies for land that had more than 25 trees per hectare, which saw quite a lot of trees pulled out across our landscapes and European landscapes.
So Liz, are you thinking you're going to do oak trees and then, like Dan says, you're using cactus guards, are you?
Yeah, so this is, because I'm excited like this. This is one lump of parkland. So you can see this is the proportion of oak that's currently present. So what's that, 75%? And you can see there's a little bit of silver birch, horse chestnut lime, but there's hardly any diversity in that as park. This is the more newer version, which was ex-arable. So you can see it's even less. And then this has got a bit more in terms of range of species in it. So what we're trying to do is sort of replicate that sort of variety across each. So that's what we're trying to achieve, I suppose.
But the problem with that is points of the compass, Liz.
Indeed, but it's just it's just interesting that they're hundreds of meters apart, North and South Park. We're not very imaginative with names, but very different in terms of what was put in there. And most of this planting is probably 150 years old.
See, there's a
Nice
competition for you. Have a field naming competition. Name Liz's
South
field.
South Park is south of South Park, if you haven't guessed. So it's just interesting, and we've got a couple of ancient hawthorns and stuff at tree level, but there's no understory around any of these. There's a couple of spinneys in this, and that's got some understory, but all of these are standalone trees in fields.
But isn't it interesting, Liz? I guess your dad hasn't really planted trees, like has he?
Yes, he is a treeaholic.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
We planted I mentioned the 3% of our land that's for woods basically, and these are sort of ungrazed woods. So probably 1% of that's been planted in the last 10 to 15 years. So we have established woods, and also because it's he doesn't like them in arable fields because they're a pain in the arse. So we've got a lot of trees in hedgerows as well. So of the 8 kilometres of hedges, most of them would have trees in them. So there hasn't been a history of successional planting in these bits of parkland. There has been trees elsewhere.
How big will the oak get in the next 40 years so you can see it, Liz? That's the most depressing bit, isn't it?
Yeah, you need some.
Just got to crack on.
You don't
I know, you
whatever
don't plant a
them for
tree.
this.
I
But
think
anyway,
what I'd really like to see with elms, I'm not sure how likely it is to happen, is a kind of added incentive for landowners to retain trees after they've planted these types of schemes, because obviously the value of them increases exponentially with time. So a landowner who put these trees in place 10 or 20 years ago, an argument could be made that they deserve to be rewarded for retaining their trees more than the landowner who's just making the decision to do it now.
Yeah.
And I just think in terms of the sort of different approaches, so more the agroforestry is that's the bit that excites me, because it's dual land purpose, isn't it? It's not saying, well, this is a grass field or an apple field. This is actually a bit of both.
It's a field.
But we've just treated it as, let's just make it really square and make it really easy to drive tractors, and actually we need to think slightly differently. We can still drive tractors easily, we just have to think about how we plant those trees.
But are the supplement is to get this message across? Is it the supplement route? Do you think farmers would jump on that maybe more than the biodiversity route? Some might, mightn't they? Do you think?
As in, it's a feed source and it's giving trace elements rather than you get.
Because I think if you're a farmer and you're kind of up against it, and if you're really a bit stressed about everything, you haven't really got the headspace to worry about butterflies.
Yeah, but the other thing we've missed, that we're going butterflies v supplements. It's the resilience in terms of that drought management, that soil retention, because the tree roots, of course, help with soil retention as well, particularly on a nice steep slope where soil start washing away. You've got the fact that, you know, I think mentioned earlier, if it's all burnt off, your grass is all burnt up, there's still green leaves on the tree. So you've got that drought feed, that emergency fodder. You know, having that insurance policy there is a really good thing. So you're still able to keep feeding yours, get that protein, get that energy in there when your grass has died, you know, burnt right off, and you haven't got that energy and protein in your grass.
So
I'd hope that
go on.
But biodiversity may not be the core motivation for everybody on this, but it's quite a clear benefit in addition to the shade, the shelter, the all the other benefits that Nigel just listed. From a livestock perspective, you're getting the biodiversity for free. And actually, the biodiversity itself, just taking a step back and thinking about the farm as a business, these schemes where they benefit biodiversity could be generating income through emerging funding sources like biodiversity net gain or natural capital trading.
And that biodiversity is an ideal feed for that species of livestock that Nick mentioned earlier, because she's mentioned the tourist. So that species of livestock, if you're going to farm tourists, then biodiversity is good.
Yeah. And so just going back to willow, there's a question just come in on willow.
There's a crabapple one you could answer as well.
That's Tim. You can. I can't. Tim doesn't listen to me. The willow. How quickly? Because some things take longer than others. Willow's quick, isn't it? So you said 2 years.
Willow can establish. I think it'll grow something like 6 or 8 feet in a year of willow. Yeah, depending on your variety or your planting. You know. Yeah, any the comment in there about drains. Yeah, any tree is going to go down into drains. Willow's not the deepest rooting tree, actually. It's quite wide and shallow. But any tree will get into your drains. But if you're in boggy land or whatever, it'll tie it together. Willow, of course, you'll see willow hugely on riverbanks, boggy land. It loves those slightly damp environments. You know, yes, you're probably gonna, you know, but then again, if you've got lots of willow there where you need your field drains.
We planted an area of willow 10 years ago now, and we coppiced it for the first time, I think 7 years after planting. And to be honest, we could have done it a fair bit sooner if we'd wanted to. And in the first year, I think we had 8 foot of growth. So that was a 7-year-old root system coppiced for the first time, and it regrew 20 stems, 8 foot in 1 year.
Wow. So Tim's asking about crab apples. I just know that ours love eating them. The calves kind of pick them. Nigel, any wisdom on a crabapple?
Nothing on a crabapple.
Oh.
Whether all willows are equal, when we've done the cobalt and sort of zinc on them, they're all moderately equal on that. In terms of total yield and leaf to stem ratio and how much is underground, I don't think the work's been done, or different varieties. It's we're now coming back to this. They'd have been around at a time where people just had a willow tree and that was it. There wasn't had a willow tree and want to know, if this willow tree is better than that willow tree. So it's probably a case for research.
There's been a bit of research done, not on all the minerals that Nigel's looking into, but on a slightly more top-level research in Scandinavia, where wood meadows are still much more common. And I'm paraquoting here, but they looked at lime, willow, ash, sycamore, alder, hornbeam. Don't think they looked at crabapple, but they found that most if not all native broadleaf species in Scandinavia had a higher fat, sugar and protein content than grass or clover. So there are a lot of species out there that have some value as fodder, even if I think not to the exception of not having grass in the system, but if they're in your hedge, they're going to be performing a useful role.
Yeah, they've all got a nutritional value. It was, as we're saying, in the stuff we did, alder was the best for energy and protein. But if you actually look at it, alder's one of the least palatable. They will avoid alder. It's down to that palatability more than anything, rather than the composition. They've all got that moderately similar composition. They've all got that hopefully around that sort of 10 ME. And then
so they love willow, they love crabapple.
Mm.
What other ones are of interest?
Hazel are quite good on, aren't they? Hazel they tend to like quite a bit. I'm trying to think what they weren't too bad on the oak leaf on feeding that. It's
ash, lime.
Ash has always been a good fodder tree. Yeah. That's one of the a hedgerow tree, so it was always a classic one that you could quite easily drop some branches down off an ash.
Okay. I looked up the I can't ever say that word, uses of crabapple, and it said an astringent and lactative, the actual crabapple, but that's in humans. So
that'll keep your tourists going, Nick.
I know. Well,
maybe
I could have a cleansing clinic, couldn't I? Like come here and just a detox
on
crabapples.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully you're not in a nitrate vulnerable zone.
No, I'm not.
I noticed our cattle when I was growing up loved hawthorn and they loved apple trees, and we once left them in the orchard slightly longer than we should have done, and we didn't have any apple trees left. But they're clearly tasty.
And Nick, on you said the ones you're planning, you're going to have apples in them.
Yeah.
Is that for you to use or?
Well, it's just I just think so. When I was in that hedge before, taking photos before at 6 o'clock, I just thought at that point when we did that in 2019, we weren't thinking about fruit trees, and I just think if you've got, I don't know if damsons grow here or plums and stuff. Well, it's just cool, isn't it? We can grow food, and it's worth just worth a try, isn't it, with a tree? Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly, I think on some of the telly there was certainly some good damson production getting up in that sort of northwest area. I can remember seeing something on there, and I think they grow in a lot better places. And of course, if you've got lots of apples, that's more cider for your tourists.
Well, the apples is probably for the pigs. Our pigs are eating a lot of apples at the minute. But I just think we kind of can, if we've got the land, we can do lots of things on it. And I just think it's quite cool to, if you're moving the cows or something, just to be able to go and grab a plum. It probably won't ever happen. A plum off a tree. Oh, Liz is gone.
Oh dear.
A plum off a tree, Liz. That's all. But it's we've got to make them grow first.
Yeah,
I've definitely noticed over the years where I fed the cattle, there are a lot of damson trees because I was throwing the stones. I'd be picking them whilst walking the dogs and then throwing them whilst feeding the cattle.
Yeah. So about to say some.
But I suppose the fact is, I'm back. But in terms of we have got the land and we can use it differently, but also it's a cost, isn't it? So I know we've heard of benefits, and we've heard from a supplementation perspective, we've heard from a biodiversity perspective, and maybe in the future will be rewarded on that regard. But you've mentioned FIPL as a way of funding some of this tree planting, haven't you? We've mentioned Woodland Trust. What are other ways of getting? Dan, you'll be more aware of other ones as well. Where people can get.
There's because we're actually doing this with quite a lot of landowners at the moment, and it's a bit irritating that stewardship situation is a bit tricky. If you're not in higher tier stewardship, you can't get funding that route for wood pasture creation. But there are other routes out there. So there's the funding in protected landscapes, FIPL, if you're in an AONB or a national park anywhere in the country. And I've got at least 5 or 6 projects at the moment where they're funding tree planting and grassland enhancement on the same plot of land through FIPL. There's the biodiversity net gain. That's something that we're already using to fund some projects, which is basically where someone, usually a property developer or an infrastructure company like a road builder, has had a negative impact on biodiversity, and in order to offset it, they pay a landowner to create some habitat. And generally, if you're starting with, say, an arable field of very little value, and you want to turn it into grassland with trees, the better you make it for biodiversity, the more money you're going to get. But you're looking at getting at least probably, let's say, 2 to 3 units per hectare, which amounts to about £40,000 to £60,000 per hectare. And you can continue to use that land as part of your normal farming system if you design it carefully. So compared to things like Forestry Commission tree planting grants, it's quite a lucrative route. And we'll probably see other things like nutrient offsetting and other kinds of natural capital funding for things like recreational value if you're farming tourists, but also air quality, water quality, nitrate and nitrate vulnerable zones as ways to bring money in that are kind of indirectly related to farming, but don't prevent you from being able to keep the land the way you're currently using it.
There's some big amounts of money there, Dan. Can you put in the chat what people need to Google or search for? Because I just think it's.
I'll try. Yeah.
Or at some point we could put it in a link, can't we, Liz? When we. Yeah. It's just
should we do that?
Because we kind of shut these things out, and then it's difficult for people to.
So there's a question from Taya. It's not how you pronounce it, but in terms of which AONBs and which FIPL's program teams you're talking to. So yeah, if you're happy, I'll connect you on email.
Sure. So national parks and AONBs that we have spoken with include North York Moors, who are sent at least 2 or 3 people on every one of our training courses this year, and sending some of their volunteers next year. They're actively looking at wood meadow and wood pasture creation and how they can fund it. The Yorkshire Dales National Park are also behind this sort of thing, and a landowner spoke to me recently and said the Malvern Hills AONB had been recommending wood meadow to them. I can't think of any others, but there have been others. But if I'm always hesitant to encourage people to get in touch with me, but we do offer training courses on this sort of thing, and we're working on producing written guidance. So keep an eye on our website, I guess. But I'm hoping that in the future we'll be able to recruit members of staff who can be farm advisors and actually go out to farms and offer people support with helping them figure out what's what's going to work on a farm by farm basis. I think part of the challenge is that a prescriptive approach isn't ideal for this type of project.
So just one bit in the chat about how easy it is to sort of establish willow with willow already in the farm. Willow is one of those easy ones that you can just cut a stick and plant it to a certain extent. So you should be able to almost generate your own willow from your own willow trees that are on farm already. Just probably a matter of getting yourself a trench and planting, healing in a load of willow twigs, and they should root, and then you've got yourself a nursery. But I'm sure there's some proper information on that, but it's you should better just chop one up and chop it into bits and get it to establish. I think the longer your bit is, the slightly stronger it is in terms of establishing.
When you're planting those short rotation coppice systems, kind of put them in the ground February, March, provided you've got one or more kind of buds, you can be putting in stuff that's only kind of 2 inches, 3 inches long. But like Nigel says, the longer it is, the more
quicker it
success
establishes.
Yeah.
So that was.
We've done quite a lot of willow pegs. It's just we've had the best results with the wider the diameter. So the chunkier the peg, and they look ridiculous when you first put them in, and then it just turns into a tree.
I suppose you're just starting to coppice it from your little peg, aren't you? Really?
Yeah, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
Something we did a couple of years ago was where we wanted more willow. We had some willows, we fenced it off, and we effectively laid it where you'd lay a hedge, just kind of pinned it to the ground in a few different directions. And 2 years later, we've got massive copse. They grow a lot quicker if they're attached to an existing root system than even just putting the cuttings in. It's hard to stop it growing, to be honest, willow.
Well, if it's growing too much, just heavily graze it till you get on top of it.
Okay.
Waiting for that. I'm just conscious of time, so if we'll do the last couple of we've answered most of the questions really, but if anybody's got any final questions, please
So there was a hand up then, Liz. So
yeah, I sent a message, and
okay.
It's now gone, and I've put a couple of links into the chat, one Dan's website, and also a little bit about biodiversity net gain, or somewhere to get some information, the basic information. So I suppose my question to Nick then is, will you be out there pollarding?
Well, really, I'd like to get Dan here to show us how.
Get somebody else to do the work for you.
Yeah.
I
can't get my head around harvesting tree hay. I can't get my head around that, but I want to get my head around it. It just.
It's not mandatory.
No, but I think we need to look into it. I just can't. I need to see it, I think.
But and I suppose we also need to understand how, and I think it's the volume you need. But I think, as said, is the wood chip approach might be an easier one.
Well, you've also got the thing. There's no reason you can't wood hay, dry it, and then actually split it off. You probably knock it off with a pair of rotation brushes, catch all your leaf. That's going to be a higher value feed, and then you've got the potential of chipping up the rest for your bedding.
But I think looking at Nigel's numbers on his experiment, I think it's definitely, and I know there's some vets on the call, I think it's definitely got legs to, it's a bit of a, when you're kind of faffing on getting lambs in to doze them and all that kind of stuff. And we have actually, let me check with Reno, it was cobalt, wasn't it, in those cattle? We had cattle that weren't growing. And it was cobalt, because along this ridge here, kind of pennines, we're just very low in selenium and cobalt. So we had a big group of cattle 2 years ago that just didn't grow, and it was cobalt.
Mm-hmm. I've just remembered something we were chatting about the other day. Was this just reminded me when you mentioned vets? Was this historical idea of a hospital field? I was at a pub down in Essex the other day, and they had this map of all the field names in the parish. I don't know how many fields there were, about 200. And probably 20 of them were called hospital field or hospital ley, and they were tended to be next to the homestead on slightly less productive areas of land. And what they were was species-rich wildflower meadow, often with trees. And in Sweden, they call them leafy meadows because they have so many trees. And it's a place where if you've got an animal that looks slightly less than 100%, you stick it in the hospital field and let it self-medicate.
Yeah, there's a few around. I know there's a couple of farms have got that, and they've got a lot of willow in it, and they would have probably had a lot of willow in that time, utilising the salicylic acid as well. And one of the going back again, historical context of willow, they used to boil up the leaves on the stove to make a sort of cure-all tonic they used to give to their stock as well. So one of these like home brew type things, they brewed up the willow tonic.
We are not advocating home brew, just saying.
Homebrew beer's all right.
So, but Liz, are you clear on what you need to plant?
I think, and yes, and I think what I'm more interested in is the how we plant them. I don't mean like that because we dig a hole and put a tree in, but in terms of the design of how we plant them, and we seem to have this very clear line, which is this is apart from fields with standing trees, this is a spinney, nothing gets in them. So I think it's more thinking about being able to access them as well, and not doing it in such regimented oak, walnut, lime. So yeah, it's helped think about, and this how to promote understory in some of our existing fields as well.
Yeah.
But it was still, and the challenge is always once you've got very established trees, getting anything to grow underneath them is a whole different battle, isn't it? But it's maybe think differently, definitely.
Yeah, but no, it's been really good, really good. I think we need a tree hay making field day run by Dan.
I'm trying to remember, there is somebody over your way, Nick, in Cumbria, who's much more of an authority on tree hay than I am, but I'll when I remember, I'll tell you, and maybe we can all go visit them.
Yeah.
Ali Fleming's just asked two very good questions in the last 2 minutes. So, should we revert more woodlands back to wood pasture? I'm guessing I know Dan's answer.
I'd love to see that happen. It's a tricky one because you don't want to be the ecologist that tells somebody to go and put pigs in their woodland that has the last remaining flower of a certain species. So I think it's probably, again, a farm by farm question. But yeah, a lot of our woodlands that have really lost species in the last 100 years, it's because they've lost the open spaces that have been there for centuries. And yeah, restoring those open spaces, putting the cattle back in some of these woods where it's appropriate, it's a change I'd love to see in the landscape.
And there'll be some thinning and all sorts happening, won't it? It can't just be stock, but okay. And another one which was just on ash with regard to dieback, and that it's such a great foliage tree. So in terms of options, I suppose, or
unfortunately, ash trees that are pollarded or coppiced seem to be slightly more vulnerable to dieback. I think it's perhaps that there's damage to the tree that much closer to the main trunk.
And you're weakening the tree anyhow by taking stuff off it, so it's upsetting the balance.
Weirdly, I was only looking at that today. We've got a run of ash trees in some hedges, and some are fine and some are dying back. And where you look up the tree, it's where they've had a branch snapped off previously, so you can see a scar or something that it might be an entry point or anything, isn't it? Or something stressed that tree out.
Having said that, I was at a brilliant little tea garden near Richmond in North Yorkshire called Helworth Tea Garden yesterday, and this time last year, their two veteran ash that must be 200-300 years old looked dead from ash dieback. And they did a bit of pollarding, kind of remedial pollarding, and this year they look like they've completely recovered, presumably temporarily, but who knows?
Okay, so it might be worth a try, is the answer. What's the worst that can happen? It just dies quicker, sadly. Well, that seems a negative way to end.
No, I think it's been good. I think Nigel needs to get some funding, and I think it's great how Dan, the ecologist, is saying that cows have always been in the landscape, and he loves to see cows in a wood. So
I love to see cows in a wood. I love to see cows in fields. We're
Combine them
losing
together.
some species from the dales because there aren't as many cows there as there used to be.
With now stuff's going to go down. I think there's going to be payment more on a carbon capture basis. Trees are great for capturing carbon.
But so is grassland.
Carefully managed grassland.
And imagine putting them together, that additive benefit you would get.
Anyway, we're now convincing ourselves of what we already believe. So that's good. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Hang on, Liz, you need to talk about next time, yeah?
Oh yeah, excellent point. So the third of this in terms of resilient systems is we're going to be focused on tall grass grazing. So we've got the legends that are David and Fergus down from Kent, who have were actually some of the first people to introduce me to mob grazing systems. And we've also got Emily Padfield, who's currently just been to see Alan Savory's research station, I suppose, in Zimbabwe. So they're there. So we're talking to them on the 10th of November about tall grass grazing. That's mainly with cattle, to be fair. So I'll send out the details shortly. But thanks, everybody. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.